everyone. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you very much for joining us today for our Space, Place, and Memory panel with Refract Journal. We are Leslie Lodwick and Matthew Simmons. We're both PhD students at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and we are incredibly excited to be with you all here today as part of Refract Journal's very first symposium and our third published volume, the theme of which is Hauntings and Traces. Each of our panelists today contributed original research to the volume aligned with the issue's themes, while they also each offer interventions to these issues of space, place, and memory that our panel will be interrogating and thinking through a little bit today. We do have a few questions for our wonderful panelists, but before jumping in, we'd like to ask each of you to introduce yourselves, your institutional affiliation, and also say a few words about your own research currently and or artistic practice, as well as just a very brief synopsis of your contribution to the panel. So Montana, can we start with you? You're the first person on my left.
Sure. My name is Montana Torrey. I'm currently a lecturer at Chiang Mai University in Chiang Mai, Thailand. And I do site-specific installations that kind of explore the intersection between architecture and climate. And my contribution to the journal is documentation of an installation that I did in northern Thailand. It's sort of a reimagining of an archaeological site called Wang Kum Kam, and it was flooded several hundred years ago. So my installation kind of reimagines this moment of collapse within the site.
Great, thank you. Okay, Whitney.
Hi there. My name is Whitney Sage. I'm an assistant professor of art at North Central College in Naperville, Illinois. I'm originally from suburban Metro Detroit area, and my work, my artistic practice, mainly revolves around Detroit history, specifically the history of the last 150 years. Primarily, I'm a multidisciplinary artist, but my most recent work, Homesickness series, which is featured in Refract Journal, takes the language of tintype photography through the use of ink painting to create these sort of reverse negatives of former domestic spaces in and around the Detroit sort of struggling neighborhoods. So the work in its various sort of manifestations aims to kind of connect and capture homes that have been lost and homes that are in the process of being lost, as well as sites where the history is no longer known. So my work, as well as sort of an extended philosophical artist statement, is my contribution to this edition of Refract.
Seb, I don't get it.
Yeah, hi, my name's Seb Wigdel-Bowcott. I'm a research master student at the University of Amsterdam, following the cultural analysis program. It's like an interdisciplinary humanities program. My research at the moment, it's hard to say what kind of links it all. It's quite broad, but I guess it's an interest in kind of competing narratives and histories that coalesce around objects and sites and spaces, these kind of overdetermined things that kind of become much more than what they actually mean themselves. And I guess my contribution to Refract speaks to this a bit. It tells of an encounter with a slate mine ruined site in rural North Wales, where I'm from. And the article, in a broad sense, is about things in general, like processes of meaning making and the ability to tell stories with spaces and objects. And then more specifically, it's about the site itself and about unraveling its history and making some global connections to a space that is, I think, widely regarded more as a national, a space of a national history.
I think it's my turn. My name is Ceren Göǧüş. I am right now an associated professor in Kültür University in Istanbul, and I actually usually work on 19th century Ottoman Empire architecture and this kind of cultural relationship with most European countries and so on and so forth. But this research that we have done with Asiye, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, is a little bit different. It was mostly her general research area, to be honest, but we try to understand the less changes that we see in the Taksim Square, which is one of the more important squares of Istanbul, and try to understand the less a kind of abundant state that it found itself. And to be able to understand it, we try to see the other kind of layers in the history of Taksim Square where this kind of change happened, which we try to connect with the ideas of the capitals of Bourdieu, if that was the idea that there was this kind of cyclical change of dominant capitals, which changed the face of the square every 20, 30, 40 years and stuff like that. So that's basically what we have done. And yeah, that's it.
Thank you very much. Yeah, all of you, as we'll see, deal with this palimpsestic quality of built space, right, in each of your pieces, and I think you can hear it in the introductions in a way. And they each interrogate the ways that traces reveal ideologies and social histories embedded in these spaces. Can you each speak to how your study is revelatory of the layers of ideologies or histories over time? And Whitney, if you want to start.
Absolutely. Yeah, for me, thinking about this idea of layered space, I think it kind of connects back to the sort of tension in a lot of the different individual works from the homesickness series of what's present, what's lost, and what's unknown. So there's these sort of there's a sort of a multitude of layers in terms of what exists and what is no longer present, and what we can't know is no longer present. And so that sort of manifests itself in the work through the landscape and the sort of natural motifs that are there that document what's present, as well as in some of the pieces, these sort of absent negative space forms that show structures no longer present. But then in some of the works, it's just documenting the site that's before you. So there's not a history or a marker or anything, any sort of traces left behind of what existed, or there's very minimal traces, maybe just a sidewalk going to a no longer present stoop. So I sort of think about the layers of space in that way. Something that I thought was kind of interesting in terms of the pairings of the different authors in this panel was I really liked some of the connections to the power of this layered history and what is allowed to remain. And I thought that was really interesting. And I see that as maybe being something that I kind of, a reoccurring sort of tension that I face in my own work. In that a lot of the history that I'm relating to is the history of, 19th century Detroit, but what's not being acknowledged is the history of those sites in terms of their importance to native populations that existed far before, mid-century, Detroit, middle-class America. So I thought that was a really interesting pairing in terms of some of the different conceptual groundings. But for me, that's where I see this kind of layered history coming from, is this tension of what's there, what's not there, and what's kind of in the process of disappearing.
Anyone else like to jump in here?
I can definitely speak to the sense of disappearing for sure. It resonated what you said just now. I think, yeah, something about physical traces and just like a not quite being there definitely speaks to my object. This site in particular is special because it's there's really not a lot there. If you come at it, the direction I encountered it from didn't give a sense of where it is contextually in a physical sense. It's actually amongst the whole labyrinth of other ruins, which have like lasted in far better state than this site specifically. It feels like a bomb site almost. It's like a vast open space in the middle of a mountain. So yeah, I really like this idea of the palimpsest. That's been nice to think along with. It really speaks to this sense of like the way these sites were like built up over time to changing demands. I mean, you go there now and you get the sense that it's all there and it was there in one go, but yeah, all these buildings were kind of erected to changing demands, kind of accumulated over time. And I think that's important to bear in mind if we're trying to get a sense of the rise and fall of an industry, as I'm trying to do here a bit. I also like the palimpsest because you get this idea of kind of new knowledge or new meaning, not just being overlaid, but then suppressing older knowledge and older meanings. And that's, I think, an initial feeling or fear that I had when I started writing about this, because there's most likely going to be like a UNESCO World Heritage status assigned to this site and others in North Wales, I guess in recognition of sort of significant industrial landscape. And yeah, my paper starts with a kind of ambivalence towards this very likely prospect. Wanting recognition in one sense, because my encounter was in a lot of ways just a surprise that there was no signage, no kind of museum framing or anything, or no conservation there at all. But then also a fear at the kind of narratives that are likely going to be assigned to these sites and how they're going to be popularly understood through this kind of large-scale institutionalized heritage framing. So the paper goes from there and tries to unravel these kind of traces and connections that will likely be lost with this framing. It's maybe a paranoid reading place to start, but I found it productive. And yeah, I go in a bit of a chaotic way and touch on a lot of things. So working in living arrangements in these mines in the 19th century, it was a big turning point as industrialization took hold in rural Wales. So we get big sort of sense of historical change, and I flesh out a bit a very sort of modern Welsh language identity that emerges at this time in answer to these historical changes. And then maybe most significantly, I flesh out connections between the slave industry and the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism more generally. A lot of the wealth that allowed for the slave industry to be set up, and a lot of the infrastructure that came from it was funded by the slave trade. And there's not much of this in writing, so I guess that's what my case study ultimately speaks to.
I can maybe talk about a little bit this as well, because I mean, it's basically what we are talking about in the text, this fact that this kind of layers on the Taksim Square, which also breaks the collective memory in a sense from time to time, which was rather interesting for us, which actually brought us to this idea of cyclical layers, because we our own memories, our generation's memories, as CSM minds, and then the generations before us, the generations after us, their memories of Taksim, they are usually so very different, which is quite interesting. Some things always stay the same, but some things definitely changes because of, and that's why we try to look for a reason for it. And that's why we turn to Bordeaux and so on, Bordeaux and so on. And it's basically the most interesting thing is, of course, for us human beings when something tries to destroy another thing, because that's what happens when another power comes. You can obviously see in Taksim, again, we try to explain it in a so many words in the text. I don't want to go into that again, but the buildings that are being demolished, the buildings that are being rebuilt or trying to be rebuilt, and so on and so forth. It just shows very strongly this idea of trying to deface in a sense, or erase, and bring something new to a space which is obviously full of symbolical power. So yeah, I mean, that was also what actually pulled us in a sense. And again, what we tried to do was try to find some kind of a theoretical background to this. What can this be, and how this might be, how does it work? I mean, as just as a beginning, let's say, not just trying to explain everything, but yeah. So that was also the layers and how they just how the power changed hands and created this layers was interesting for us.
I guess it's my turn. Yeah, in my installation, based on Mein Kumkam, I was really using this site kind of as a catalyst to explore the idea of the ruin, and time kind of persisting through architecture, and also how this site became a ruin, and kind of unearthing that exact moment, and also the process in which it became a ruined and abandoned site too. So I was using sort of a spatio-temporal kind of installation to kind of recreate this floating of the dense bricks, and also trying to evoke kind of this feeling of weightlessness, and this reimagining of the actual flooding within the site.
Thank you all. Let's move on to the next question. We can come back to some of these ideas, maybe at the end. I think there's some good connections we can draw between these pieces. The next question is specifically kind of about the current state that we find ourselves in globally. These pieces were all written ostensibly before the global pandemic. So how might the framework of the pandemic and changes in your thought processes during it, et cetera, how might it reveal new understandings or traces at your sites or your case studies? And maybe, Ceren, you mind starting?
Me? Oh, okay.
Yes.
Okay. So for us, sorry, what did you say?
Sorry if I said your name wrong.
No, it's okay. No problem. So basically, yeah, pandemic, for us, the interesting thing is, I guess, that it showed the dominant power, although it looks so very strong, can be actually very fragile when it comes to this kind of a catastrophic thing that happens globally. And I don't know, it's so early to tell. I mean, we are still in the crisis, by the way. But the interesting thing is going to be, because Taksim's right now, the dominant power is basically economical power, and it is very much consumer based. And it got hurt by of course. I mean, it's also mostly tourism. It depends on the tourism. So it really got hurt with all the restrictions, with travel restrictions, although the government did try to limit the restrictions on the tourists. The residents had more restrictions, tourists didn't, and so on and so forth. But I mean, with the travel restrictions, there's not much you can do. So there was a damage done, but the interesting thing is going to be if this is going to be a catalyst, for example, like Delanda says, this kind of, if there's going to be an opening for a change, a new dominant capital that is born through this. Kind of, it is going to force the phase transition, for example, is what I mean. But again, it's early. I'm not so sure, and I'm sure there are some fail safes that stops this kind of thing from happening with the dominant capitals. They do try to survive, and they usually manage. So yeah, we are going to see that, but that was the most, I think, interesting thing that we have seen with the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, I know for myself, specifically with work that is relating to domestic spaces, there's a lot of connections and a lot of sort of interesting outcomes that relate to what's going on currently. For me, the work that I've produced is kind of looking at the idea of the home as being and the disappearance and the ravaging of homes as being related to the experience of trauma. And I think that this is a really traumatic moment when you look at just universally, even outside of the United States, just joblessness, evictions, poverty, you know, the further heightening of the problem of poverty, and people being separated from their homes. I mean, I think we're just going to only see that, unfortunately, in larger and larger quantities. And so I think in creating work that tries to relate to an audience beyond its sort of contextual boundaries through this idea of this connection to a site or a place or a home, I think the pandemic is only going to, I get in terms of that way, just because the trauma and the impact this has is going to be way more, you know, wide ranging than a specific region or a specific area. So while not everybody is from a Rust Belt post-industrial area, we're seeing this impact regions, areas, communities across types of across economic classes. And I think it'll, in a lot of ways, make the work more resonant with people in a really traumatic, horrible way. So it's been interesting to think about relationship of home, especially too when, you know, the home has been such a point of like comedic content right now, where people talk about, you know, being stuck at home and being miserable at home, but then we also have this other sort of layer of people losing homes. So it's this kind of domestic space becomes really relevant in a moment like now.
I'm finding this one really hard to answer. I'm not sure how much I would change if I'm trying to think about applying the pandemic as a framework specifically. And I just think it would bring out a lot of what's already in there about global interconnections, global entanglements, and specifically global vulnerability, I suppose. Yeah, the pandemic's been a global moment, and that's what's illuminated for sure, these interconnections and specifically the hierarchies that exist within that entanglement for sure. This is kind of the direction I think my article goes in to some extent, in wanting to recast that national history as a global one that involves like a very complex web of exploitation. But yeah, I was editing and extending this a bit as the pandemic was going on, so maybe it was informed by that a tad, but I'm not sure how much it would change.
Yeah, and for me, I guess just on kind of in a practical way as an artist, it's definitely completely changed my way of working. It's kind of hard to go to sites and also very hard to create, you know, large scale installations that people can kind of experience. So I think just in terms of my own practice, I think that, like, you know, I've had to kind of come up with different ways of imagining kind of an archaeological framing. So yeah, it's kind of shifted my way of working.
Yeah, that was really great. So another question interlap we saw in all your pieces was the different types of theories you use. So you're all talking about similar subjects, but you're coming at them from very different angles. So thing theory, affect, memory, and spatial theory were all in each of your works in some way. Not necessarily all of them were. But can you speak to why you use the site you do and how they allow you to reveal how the site changes over time? Are there other methodologies that you think need to be employed to further interrogate the objects and case studies that you chose for your piece? And why don't we start with Montana?
Let's see. Why I chose Swing was really because I wanted to kind of have this sort of extraction or kind of reimagining of sort of the geological layers that the city was buried underneath. So I think this particular site for me had this kind of buried history that I thought that I could potentially connect sort of catastrophic events of its past through this flooding to the present. Sorry, what was the second part of the question?
Is there a type of methodology, or in your case, maybe even a type of modality of art that you would use to further interrogate object or case?
Yeah, I think that if I were to continue to go back to this site or to use this site within my work, I would probably continue to kind of use this kind of like speculative archaeological framework. But I think in the future, I would probably focus more on kind of more of the material traces through objects and how the objects have kind of evolved through time, not just focusing specifically on the built environment. So I think, yeah, I would kind of expand that way of thinking, but more kind of with, yeah, the actual objects that were found within the site also.
I can jump in. Basically, as I said before, we started with the site. So it was just not, we actually started with the theory and chose the site. The site came first. But what brought on the theory was the, when we look at Taksim, the history, the narratives, blah, blah, we have seen that it actually has almost all of the social and physical resources that the capitals of Bordeaux needs to thrive. And we have seen that they actually used it from time to time to dominate space of Taksim and actually just grow from there. And they show their legitimacy in that sense sometimes, all through Turkey. So yeah, I mean, basically the site came first, and it was apparently had all of this. I mean, it had culture, it had politics, it had economical resources that could be used. It was very obviously from the first point on, even from the Ottoman times, a kind of power space that can be actually used to affect others and so on. So that's the main reason why Taksim and why this Messi and Bordeaux theories, why we use them together. As further studies, again, considering all of this, it doesn't make much sense, and it's hardly helpful to use official history. So even something new is going to be done on this subject. Again, as we have done, we try to see this cyclical nature. We try to actually somewhat close the gaps that was left by the official history with this kind of much more the narratives of the non-official narratives, let's say, non-governmental narratives, and so on and so forth. The same thing can be done even more. I mean, what we have done is just a small portion of it. For example, we have used these postcards a lot in our article. We have found these postcards and they were interesting to us because postcards are usually used to make a place a little bit more interesting, a little bit more attractive. And it was interesting. We could only find a very small time period. The postcards that we have found are from a very small time period. But you can see which buildings they choose to show, for example, very significantly, the hotels and stuff like that, whatever was interesting in that time period. So maybe analyzing this kind of works of visual culture in a much more bigger scale, that can be very interesting. It can be also analysis of comparative discourses and narratives, how that worked, the discussions, and that can be also very helpful. So again, staying out of the much more traditional chronological historical sense, but trying to see creating a larger image of the space might be helpful, I think.
Yeah, I think for me also, I love, just building off of what you're saying, I love that look deeper dive into the postcards. I think that would be really fascinating. Postcards have always been really interesting to me. I did a whole series of postcards previously, but sidebar. For me, the sites, honestly, just in reflecting on this question, it's kind of caused me to sort of evaluate the sites that I've chosen and how those sites reflect the message that the overall series communicates. And in the series thus far, which is an ongoing series, I've noticed that there is a tendency to reflect on sites that have devolved back to nature. However, there's something very sort of, I guess, almost apocalyptic or sort of natural about those sites in particular, where there's almost a way that you could look at them as being without, their devolution as being without a cause or a reason. And so what's sort of missing in those sites, maybe naming the forces at play to why certain sites were allowed to disappear. And so something I've been sort of thinking about is looking at different types of sites where it's the home space hasn't been replaced with nature or hasn't been allowed to go back to nature, but home spaces that have been purposefully taken down for the reconstruction of something else. So specifically in Detroit, which follows the sort of trajectory of most modern cities, in the building of the interstate system, they bulldozed directly through historically African American neighborhoods. So thinking about what that sort of negative home image looks like in context to a highway overpass versus this sort of natural environment that sort of describes most of the series up to this point. So I think looking at different types of sites could be really enriching for this series in the way that it would open up maybe more layers of history and maybe begin to sort of implicate more forces at play.
In my case, I also started with the site. I really liked the way that was framed. Yeah, the idea was to let the site dictate the theoretical framework that developed around it, so as not to kind of delimit the type of questions that could be asked of it, and more go off that initial encounter and the questions that were raised in that moment. And so I was having to find the theory that kind of spoke to that experience, and just happened that thing theory in a kind of new materialist kind of way, combined with affect theory, kind of spoke to that, because there were no narratives there already to kind of deal with or confront or unpack. So whereas a lot of similar work on post-industrial ruins are doing in that context with kind of heritage framings and utilizing kind of narrative analysis and so on, I couldn't do that, and I kind of had to broaden my search and went from sort of archaeological work that, of these kind of sites that were being forgotten or had very limited framing, and those were usually the kind of theoretical frameworks that were being used, and could see the kind of work they were doing there. So that's what brought me to my theoretical framework. But then it's still dealing with the kind of questions that could be asked inevitably. I'm not saying it to kind of completely open anything. So there were things that I feel glaring omissions now. You asked to answer your sub question. Like I'm shocked it doesn't go in an ecological direction. Like it's really there glaring at the center of the case studies, this interaction between human life forms and the natural environment, and the extraction of natural resources, and it embodies a certain attitude towards the natural environment as well, particularly the way it's been, the attitude that allowed it to operate, but then the attitude that this kind of careless exit as well, leaving these vast ruinous environments. So yeah, it's funny to read it now and think about what direction I would go in, but it just didn't come up, and that kind of came from that initial approach of letting the site dictate the theoretical framework.
Yeah, I want to come back to this idea about extraction as for our last question, but before we go to the very last question of our panel, I wanted to kind of create a space for the panelists to kind of comment on each other's work, pick up some of the threads of things that came out during this conversation from the previous 3 questions, and see if there was anything that anyone wanted to bring up and talk a little bit more, ask each other about more specifically. It might be, the answer might be no. But there are a couple of, a couple other things that we noticed, and I think a couple of you brought up this idea about power that kind of threads through all of the work. And I wondered if anybody who was familiar with each other's papers or artistic, research wanted to kind of bring up any of these ideas that they'd heard from the conversation.
I mean, I know for me, first of all, I just really appreciated the cross-section of approaches and content across this grouping. I just really loved the overlaps and just being exposed to the different research that everyone's doing. But for me, I know that I particularly took a lot away from the evolution of Taksim Square. I thought that was a really interesting study into the multiple layers of the space and how the space is allowed or being structured to evolve to reflect different ideologies. I just thought that was really fascinating. I've always been interested in the history of monuments and memorials and public spaces that are sort of designed to function sort of in that way. And I think I saw a lot of sort of crossover with my own work, and I really enjoyed seeing the history of that and the deep dive into kind of the different reasonings for the different evolutions of that one particular site. So I found myself particularly taken by that specific study and research.
Thank you. I mean, maybe all I can say is I don't have a specific question or anything like that, but for me, the interesting thing was, again, as I said, I am an architectural historian. There's usually this kind of very step-by-step way of doing an architectural historian research. and looking at things in a very specific way. Most of the time, I do try to not to do that, but there's that. And it was interesting for me to see all these different ways we can actually approach space, and all these different methods to try to understand the space that I have seen in all these papers. And that was really papers and works. That was really interesting for me. That actually is, and sometimes you can write a 20-page paper, for example, but a photography can be so much more impactful to understand what you are trying to say. So yeah, it was really impressive on that account for me specifically.
Okay, well, thank you all very much. Unless there's anything else anyone wanted to bring up, should we move on to our last question and start wrapping things up? Okay, so and this question might sort of apply to some of the works more specifically than others, but another thread that we saw that sort of ties these sites together is their kind of mutual capacity for extraction in multiple senses of the word. How might extraction as a concept function literally, metaphorically, socially in your work? And we can start perhaps with Seb.
Yeah, the title of my piece definitely plays with this idea of kind of, yeah, multiple functions, not necessarily extraction, but mining in a very similar way. Yeah, in a metaphorical sense, I'm putting forward the argument of the need to extract or like mine spaces and objects to draw out the complexity of their histories, because they're often obscured by dominant frames that suppress them. And then, yeah, it's obviously at the heart of the subject matter, slate mining being like an inherently extractive activity. Yeah, drawing natural resource from the earth and transforming it into a commodity. But even with that, I was trying to expand it a bit and show the kind of types of extraction that are involved in that kind of activity itself. So in the social sense of having to very actively, actually, in this case, construct a labor force by extracting people from their previous life worlds and kind of building a new one. What's fascinating with this example is the kind of response to it that came from these Welsh mining communities, who just a specific conjuncture of things, religious changes and, yeah, sweeping industrialization, replacing kind of small scale farming in these areas. Out of this emerged like this kind of progressive, modern Welsh language, working class community with a very strong literary culture. So yeah, and then finally there is another form of extraction, which I mentioned kind of towards the end of the piece, which I found fascinating and explains the current state of the site in comparison to the one surrounding it, as I mentioned previously. In that once the mining operations had come to an end, a small company came in and kind of noticed there was still potential in the slate of the buildings themselves, the big mill that was there, and proceeded to like deconstruct it and turn those building slates into commodities, and kind of, yeah, repackage them as sellable slate. That was fascinating to me. It just like seemed like a very big break from one type of production to another, reminding me of Anna Singh's concept of salvage accumulation, in her case, where capitalism kind of appropriates value produced by a pre-capitalist or non-capitalist system, but in this case from a kind of previous form of capitalist production. So yeah.
So in terms of extraction, literally the brick itself is an extracted form coming out of like the alluvial silt and mud of the actual site. So there's that extraction, and then also the extraction that I used within my installation, making the collagraphs out of the silt and the mud of the Ping River also.
I can say some things about that. I mean, I just focus when we were talking about abstraction, I just focus on the loss of resources in Taksim. If that's the case, I mean, the loss of resources are very literal and very obvious. We can talk about that a lot, but basically, if we are going to focus on memory, for example, there's a lot of this kind of memory gaps because the capital changes the area so quickly. The gaps are, for example, in the 1950s, the minorities, usually non-Muslim minorities, had to move out. We just touched very shortly in the text, but because of a political unrest, and they completely left the area. So that's created this kind of huge gap in the memory. I mean, if you think about it, 100 years, that's a group of families live in a place, and then they just have to move on. And then in their place, the new low-income families came from Anatolia. They lived there for a while, but then in the end of the 19th, this time around, they needed to live because of a kind of, I think we can see this as a preemptive action to prepare the space to be an economical hub. So they have to live. So there was another break. And now this kind of shift from cultural or cultural-based economic capital to a very pure consumption-based economical capital, a lot of cultural space are getting lost here. The cultural resources are getting lost, like again, things that we already have said, cinemas, theaters, so on. The rents are incredibly high, everyone needs to move on. So that's another loss. And also, again, the square as a meeting place, as a celebration place, as a protest place, that's needed to stop as well, because a lot of reasons, but I guess the simplest one is economical capital hangs on the comfort of the customer, which rarely goes hand in hand with very loud political speech. So, I mean, that's needed to change as well. And this time around, we are seeing even a bigger break in the memory, because not only the residents have changed, but also visitors have changed. Not only the residents of the area are not the same anymore, but people who went there for festivals, for any kind of cultural activity, they are not going there anymore. There's nothing there. So again, a bigger break happened this time around. So I think when I look at the loss, I mean, the resources, yes, they are lost. We are also using physical historical buildings, for example, like the Opera House and the 19th century building stock. But also the kind of collective memory breaks that we are getting here. So the historically, that kind of loss, that kind of conscience that is getting lost, that's also, I think, a very important part of it.
You kind of relate to one idea of this term of extraction. Something that I talk about, conscious of, in terms of why it's important to extract the history from these sites, is that there's been a trend in sort of media representations of Detroit since 2008, and when the city declared bankruptcy a few years later. There was this sort of trend in media narratives to sort of represent Detroit as this land of opportunity, this sort of open, this land of like infinite possibility, where you have space to come in and do things. So it was a narrative that in a lot of cases was used to attract people from larger cities where space is an issue, to come and say, hey, look at all this open space that you have access to, and it's cheap, and you can come here and you can make things. And in a lot of ways, the space has made opportunities for people that would have been otherwise sort of unavailable to them, which is why it's become something of an artist hub. But in a lot of ways, I think it's important to recognize why that space exists, as well as to acknowledge that this is not just a open, unused urban prairie that just happens to exist. I think it's important to acknowledge the history of land use and land ownership and who is allowed to own land and why that land has become abandoned, to talk about what happened to housing values, what led people to abandon their homes because it wasn't worth it to sell them because they weren't worth selling. So I think this idea of extraction is important because I think the city itself and that land has become almost seen as a resource to be extracted. And I think that can be incredibly problematic when you look at the history of why that land exists. So I think it's sort of an important reintroduction of the history and the context of how that city came to be, to understand systemic forces at play.
Yeah, definitely. That was really amazing, the way that extraction, all the power relationships and so on play into all of your work. It's great to see that. Thank you everyone for answering the questions and participating, and for your pieces in Refract Journal. Leslie, is there anything else you wanted to say?
No, thank you so much, everyone, for your time and for your energy toward this and your excellent, incredible contributions to our journal. We really appreciate each and every one of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.